Hi, my name's Ken Jones. I'm managing editor of the journal Professional Development and Education. I'm one of the organisers of the 2021 Leadership for Professional Learning Symposium, sponsored by PDiE. The focus of this year's event is leadership within technology-enhanced professional learning spaces. And we're carrying out short interviews with a number of authors. Articles have recently been published in PDiE. These interviews will be part of the resource base for the symposium, and recordings will be available generally for a limited period on the LFPL and journal websites. Details of these will be made available at the end of this interview. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Helen Kocher of the University of Dundee, Scotland, the author of the article Harnessing Technology to Enable the Flow of Professional Capital, Exploring Experiences of Professional Learning in Rural Scotland. Welcome, Helen. We selected your article because it aligns with three of the key themes of our symposium: leadership, professional learning, and technology-enhanced professional learning spaces. Tell us about your article.
Hello, Ken, and hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me along. My article the research for the articles, I should say, was done before COVID, and it was done at a time when digital connectivity in rural areas was improving fairly exponentially. So I was interested to know whether that made a difference in terms of professionals in those areas and how they were accessing professional learning and their experiences of it. It took part in the north and west of Scotland, so an area of rural and remote sort of locations. In the period between 2013 and 2017, the connectivity in that area had gone up from 4% to 86%. So for professionals in those areas, it was something which was potentially having an impact on their professional practice. It was an interview study. I had a big group of education professionals and then smaller groups of health and business professionals, and I was interested in comparing their experiences. I used the theoretical framework of professional capital because for rural professionals, they're often more autonomous because they're working in smaller groups or in a distributed network, and that can often lead to creativity. So I was interested both in how the rural professionals were able to access professional learning, but also how they could contribute to the professional community. So the flow of professional community, or professional capital enabled by the technology.
Thanks, that's an interesting summary. And of course, you can read the full article online. Some questions then, Helen. Research was undertaken in a rural context, and that's part of the essence of the work. What might be the implications for professional learning in other contexts?
One of the things that came through the research was the difference in the way in which we now engage with information. So in terms of the codified knowledge that we engage with in professional learning, rural professionals talked about how challenging it was to filter and identify and find valid and relevant sources of information online. And I think that's maybe something that is relevant across the board in terms of the difference between a physical artifact of print-based media and a digital piece of media, which is sort of vast and potentially never ending if you keep clicking on the links.
Yeah, and I think these factors have come out recently much more in evidence. An interesting point about the article is it doesn't just simply focus on education professionals. And in fact, you draw on three professionals from three sectors. You draw on health, business, as well as education. What were the significant parallels and differences that you found in your research? And what can education professionals learn from those in other sectors?
I suppose some of the significant parallels were that the filtering, the challenge of engaging with that information. One of the things that was happening in the health sector was there was discussion, or I think there was development of, it was described as an Amazon for professional learning. So developing a space where a professional could go on and say, I need to learn about this aspect of practice, and all the courses and webinars and relevant information, and importantly, trustworthy information, would then be accessible. So I think maybe there was definitely engagement from the health sector with that filtering of information. Maybe it's more accentuated when you're in a rural area. And that was maybe why that was being dealt with. sorry, sorry, Mark, I've completely lost my train of.
Yeah, we're looking at health. You've just talked about health, business and education. I think that one of the interesting things is when you describe the health professionals, for example, and the area that they've got to cover physically. That's amazing when you look at it that way, and what technology has done to sort of bring that together. I think also, yes, we're doing that in number 3, is to bring these communities together, to get them to be able to have professional dialogues. So really quick, I'll go back and ask question 2 again. We can wipe that one.
Cool.
That might be the easiest way for Mark to edit it. So we'll have a look at question 2. Okay, the research draws on professionals from health and from business, as well as from education. And that's really interesting. What were the significant parallels or differences that you found between the 3 professional sectors? And what can education professionals learn from those in other sectors?
Some of the parallels were the experience of using technology. So the digital technology enabled connections across rural areas for professionals in health who are working with distributed teams. The connectivity gave them the opportunity to develop those teams and to work together. In terms of business, that all of the business professionals talked about how the professional learning opportunities stopped at the Central Belt, and so it gave them the opportunity to go out and access those.
That's the Central Belt in Scotland, of course.
Sorry.
Glasgow and Edinburgh, because we have a wide international audience here. And I think it might be helpful, Helen, actually, sorry to cut you in full flow, just to give us an idea of the way in which these health and business professionals and education professionals worked in a Scottish context, and then come back to health and business.
So the Scottish Highlands and Islands are a large area of distributed small villages, crofts, a couple of small towns, and the health professionals were clinicians who were working across large areas, so they had to drive a long way. There was often one clinician who covered a huge physical area. The business professionals were often either lone professionals, if that's the right term, or working in very small teams. And a lot of the business and a lot of their professional learning required them, and their meetings required them to go to Inverness, which is a central place. And for some, that was a 3-hour drive. So some of the challenges of that professional learning without technology was things being cancelled or being changed in time. And if you've got a 3-hour drive and a potential overnight stay, that's a big impact. So there's real potential there for technology to make a difference. In terms of schools, the schools are much smaller, and in primary school it's often it can be 1 or 2 teachers, often in composite classes, so mixed year groups. In the senior schools there's often just 1 teacher departments, and sometimes actually a teacher might be covering a department for another school as well, which is where the technology has real potential to be developed. So there's a couple of online schools which were being developed pre-COVID, and then obviously COVID has made all that happen much more. But yeah, it's a very different context to working in the Central Belt of Scotland, which is much more urban with larger local professional communities.
And it's interesting because that the concept of the professional community, the professional learning community, is so important in the context of professional learning. And your research brings this out. How are the technologies encouraging professional dialogue then, and building professional learning communities which are more significant now? And are there times when they act as barriers to engagement for some people or groups? It isn't always a panacea, is it?
No, definitely not. I think tech does, just by the development of it, it does enable the connection and interactions between people. So there's no longer the same challenges of distance and time and cost, which were big challenges to the participants in this study. I think a significant barrier which was came across actually in all three professionals in different ways was the attitudes and experiences of technology. So lots of the people that I spoke to spoke quite passionately about their experiences of using technology. They all brought with them a history of participation. So they didn't come to it neutrally. They came to it from previous experiences, so they were quite loaded in terms of how they engaged with it. And then there was also a constant comparison between face-to-face and online. And at that point, face-to-face was seen as better. And there was sort of, online interactions were almost put in a deficit position of they're not quite as good, just not quite the same. And they weren't as good for building trust or building relationships. But it's an interesting comparison because in this context, the online interaction wasn't really a comparison with face-to-face. It was a comparison with not having any interaction because it enabled. So it was interesting that that comparison was made throughout the study. But if you actually sort of think it through, you either, from that context, you can either use the online or you can just not communicate. So there's something interesting there to sort of consider in terms of the way that our perception of the digital.
Okay. Your research was undertaken pre-COVID, pre-pandemic. What can we take forward, or should we take forward in the post-pandemic environment?
I think a couple of things that came out of the research, that one of the things that came through it was a technology infrastructure. So hopefully COVID has developed the technology infrastructure and also the skills and the competencies and our confidence in using technology. So the distribution of that technology is hopefully much better than it was before COVID. I think the importance of participation came through, and facilitation of online learning was really important. That was something that could either accentuate a really good experience, or it could really accentuate that feeling of isolation. So the facilitation was really important. In going forward, I think consideration of the equity of participation, so not just thinking about distribution, but also thinking about representation and recognition, and how we actually include people and enable them to participate, and make sure that there is that flow of capital around the community, rather than just sort of transmitting information out of a screen.
I think that notion of equity is so important, and it's one of the key themes of our symposium. Just tied into that very quickly, and one final question. To what extent does leadership need to generate this whole notion of community and the way in which professional learning is enhanced? Because you do in your article make quite a bit about agency, and the way in which, particularly in business, people acted as individuals in directing their own learning and supporting their own learning. But in an education context, the local authorities quite often take responsibility. Find any contrasts, contradictions between those two?
I was talking to colleagues about this yesterday. Actually, I think it was a really interesting comparison when I asked a very open question about, tell me your experiences of professional learning, and education professionals all started with their local authority, as that was their go-to in terms of what professional learning was, whereas health professionals talked about engaging with research, and you couldn't be a clinician if you weren't up to date with the most current research. And for business professionals as well, if you weren't up to date with what was happening, then your business wouldn't be viable. So you had that sort of agentive approach was quite different. And education professionals did then talk about their engagement with communities and their agency and using social media, but it was positioned differently. So I wonder whether the online space is an opportunity to develop that agency and that transformative approach to professional learning because of the way that because of what it is, because it allows us to make our own choices in terms of what we engage with and how we engage with it. So it'll be an interesting, I suppose it'll be an interesting challenge going forward to what some people would maybe say was a sort of a very conformist structure of professional learning coming from above. So I think from a leadership perspective, it's that engaging with the people that you're working with, and that and going back to their participation and the equity, and looking at ways in which everybody is represented and recognised in that online space. I think is a really important part of going forward and taking, seeing, because I assume that this will transform professional learning as well, and it won't look like it did post-COVID, pre-COVID, post-COVID. So yeah, I think that's an important part of going forwards.
Thanks, Helen. And I think that looking at the research that you did and the context in which you did it, it resonates so many places globally, because we quite often see professional learning models based on urban context, Western context, and quite often we forget about the challenges faced by rural areas, and particularly very remote rural areas, in professionals maintaining this up-to-dateness. Thank you very much indeed for this afternoon's interview, and I hope now that people will look at your article. It's found online, and further information on how to get Helen's article will be published on screen now. Thanks again, Helen.
Thank you very much.